In Lewina, the streets were alive with the evening buzz, the smell of roasted corn drifting through the air, and music spilling from roadside shops. Amina's heart beat a little faster as she stood in front of her small mirror, smoothing down her golden Ankara dress. Kelechi, her fiancé, had invited her to spend the evening with his closest friends. To her, it felt like a big step forward. Finally, he wanted her to be part of his world. She imagined walking into the restaurant by his side, hearing him proudly introduce her, watching his friends smile at her the way people do when they approve. She wanted to make him proud, so she spent extra time tying her geli perfectly, dabbing a soft perfume behind her ears. As she stepped out, the night air felt like it carried promise. The boda ride to the city felt shorter than usual, her mind filled with daydreams of laughter, clinking glasses, and feeling like she truly belonged. She didn't know that this night would become a memory she'd never forget, not because it was perfect, but because it would change the way she saw him forever. The evening had started warmly enough, the clink of cutlery, the smell of grilled fish and spicy jollof rice filling the air. Amina sat quietly beside Kelechi, smiling politely as his friends talked about work, football, and the latest gossip in town. She was still trying to settle into the conversation when Kelechi suddenly leaned back in his chair, grinning mischievously. "You know," he said loudly, "Amina's cooking isn't even good enough for a stray goat." The table erupted into laughter. A few of his friends slapped the table, others shook their heads and chuckled as if it were just harmless teasing. But Amina's smile froze, her fork pausing mid-air. On the outside, she gave a small laugh, the kind people give when they're trying to play along. But inside, her chest tightened, and the air around her seemed heavier. She thought of the countless evenings she had spent perfecting her egusi soup, the way she would taste it over and over, adding just the right pinch of salt, hoping he would enjoy it. And here he was, turning all of that care into a joke. She glanced at his face, looking for even a hint that he was joking in love, but all she saw was pride in how much he was making his friends laugh. The sound of their amusement rang in her ears, each chuckle landing like a small slap. She noticed one of his friends give her a quick glance, almost as if to check how she was taking it, but he quickly looked away. The waiter came to refill their drinks, and Amina murmured a soft thank you, forcing her lips into a polite smile. She didn't want to make a scene. Not yet. She picked up her glass and took a slow sip, letting the cold drink slide down her throat, trying to wash away the sting of his words. But it lingered sharp, bitter, and unforgettable. Deep down, she knew something had shifted in her that moment. The night she thought would bring her closer to him had just drawn the first crack between them. Kelechi's first joke should have been enough, but he didn't stop. It was as if making the table laugh had given him some sort of stage, and Amina had unknowingly become the performance. Between bites of food, he looked at her and smirked. "You know, in her village they probably still think electricity is magic," he said. The table burst into more laughter, some even leaning back in their chairs as if it was the funniest thing they had heard all week. Amina's fingers tightened slightly around her fork, but she kept her face composed. Then came the comments about her accent. "Sometimes when she talks," Kelechi continued, "I have to ask her twice because I don't know if she's speaking English or singing a folk song." More laughter. The sound was louder now, sharper, filling every corner of the restaurant and pressing into her ears. And just when she thought it couldn't get worse, he gave her a quick glance up and down and added, "She's still learning city life. You know, she tries." The words were meant to be light, but to Amina, they felt like stones being thrown one after the other. She thought about how hard she had worked since moving to Lewina, learning the bus routes, finding work, saving to buy clothes that would help her blend in, speaking carefully so she wouldn't be judged for her roots. All of that effort seemed invisible to him. She looked around the table. A few friends laughed along without thinking, others shifted uncomfortably but said nothing. No one defended her. It struck her then, how easy it was for people to join in or stay silent when someone else was being made small. Amina smiled faintly, just enough to hide what she was feeling, and reached for her drink. Inside, though, her chest ached, not from the words alone, but from the realization that the man she thought would protect her pride was the one tearing it apart for entertainment. That sting cut deeper than any insult. And in that moment, the night stopped feeling like a celebration. Amina didn't respond. Not because she couldn't think of what to say, but because she was choosing not to. She kept her eyes on the soft flicker of the candlelight in the center of the table, watching the flame sway with each movement of air. The laughter around her began to fade into the background, like distant noise she no longer needed to pay attention to. Inside her, something was shifting slowly but with certainty. She could have spoken up. She could have told him how hurtful he was being, how each comment was like peeling away a layer of her dignity. But she knew that sometimes, silence could be louder than words. Her stillness wasn't weakness. It was a pause, a breath before a storm. She let him talk, let the others laugh, all while she sat there, wrapping her dignity around herself like a shield. Her mind wasn't stuck on his jokes anymore. Instead, it was moving forward, asking questions she hadn't dared to ask before. Is this the man I'm supposed to marry? Is this how he will treat me when life gets harder? The answers were not comforting. Each one built a quiet wall inside her, brick by brick. Every now and then, she glanced up briefly, meeting his eyes just long enough for him to notice that her smile had faded. But she didn't hold his gaze. She returned to the candle, her hands resting calmly in her lap. Outwardly, she looked composed, as if nothing could touch her. Inwardly, she was already creating distance, pulling her heart away from his grasp. It was in that silence that Amina began to reclaim her power. She didn't need to win an argument or make him feel small. She just needed to stop giving him the space to hurt her. That moment, quiet, steady, and invisible to everyone else, was when the first seeds of her decision were planted. And once planted, they would grow into something far stronger than anything Kelechi could have imagined. Not every smile at that table was genuine. Between bursts of laughter, Amina noticed the small cracks in the performance. Quick glances, lips pressed tightly together, hands fidgeting with napkins. Two of Kelechi's friends in particular seemed to be laughing out of habit rather than amusement, their eyes darting toward her and then away, as if they didn't want to be caught feeling sorry for her. It was subtle, but she caught it all. A man at the far end of the table shifted in his seat, his laughter stopping mid-breath when Kelechi made another jab about her village ways. A woman sitting beside him forced a small smile but kept her eyes on her plate, stirring her food without eating. Their discomfort was written on their faces, though no one said a word. Amina felt a strange mix of emotions, pain that no one was stepping in to defend her, but also a quiet sense of validation. She wasn't crazy. She wasn't overreacting. They knew he had gone too far. It was there in the way their shoulders stiffened and their eyes avoided hers for too long, as if the guilt of silence was already settling in. She wondered if they stayed quiet because they didn't want to ruin the mood, or because they didn't want to challenge him in front of everyone. Maybe both. But Amina had learned something important. You can tell a lot about people by how they react when someone is being humiliated. Some will join in, some will look away, and a few will silently wish it would stop, but very few will speak up. As she looked around the table, she realized this was not just about Kelechi anymore. This was about the kind of people he surrounded himself with. People who might smile in her face tomorrow but had sat and watched her dignity be chipped away tonight. That knowledge stung almost as much as his words, but it also made one thing very clear. She didn't belong at that table anymore. And before the night ended, she would make sure they all knew it. As the night went on, the noise around the table felt more and more distant to Amina, as if she were slowly stepping out of the scene and watching it from afar. Kelechi's laughter blended with the clinking of glasses, the scrape of cutlery, the low hum of other diners in the restaurant. But inside her, there was a sharp, crystal-clear silence where a decision was forming. She knew right then, she would never allow him to humiliate her again. Not like this. Not in front of people. Not in private. Never. But she also knew she wouldn't lower herself to match his cruelty. She wouldn't throw insults back at him or make a scene in the middle of the dinner. That would only give him more to laugh about later. No, she would choose something quieter but sharper, something that would leave a mark without her raising her voice. She would choose dignity. She picked up her fork, took another bite of food, and nodded along to a conversation she wasn't even listening to. Outwardly, she was calm, her expression polite, her voice soft whenever she spoke. Inwardly, she was making plans, not just for the end of this night, but for the days ahead. Her mind was already moving beyond him, beyond the table, beyond the small circle of people who thought this was entertainment. She thought about all the years she had worked for her tailoring shop, the late nights sewing by the dim light of a single bulb, the customers who trusted her, the savings she had been building little by little. She realized she didn't need him to complete her life. She had built something for herself long before he ever came along, and she could build even more without him. By the time she set her fork down and folded her napkin neatly beside her plate, the decision was sealed. Kelechi didn't know it yet, but he had just laughed his way out of her life, and the next time he saw her, it wouldn't be as the quiet woman at the table. It would be as the woman who had walked away without looking back. When the plates were nearly empty and the laughter still floated around the table, Amina quietly reached for her bag. She smiled politely, the kind of smile that gives nothing away, and said softly, "I should be heading home. I have an early morning tomorrow." Kelechi barely looked at her, just gave a small shrug as if her presence or absence didn't matter. That was fine. She wasn't leaving for his attention. She was leaving for herself. She stood, smoothing her golden Ankara dress, feeling the weight of every eye that briefly turned toward her. There was no rush in her steps, no hint of anger or humiliation, just calm, deliberate grace. She said her goodbyes to the group, her voice light, and walked out into the cool night air. The streets were quieter than the restaurant, the air fresher, the sound softer. As she made her way toward the Boda Boda stand, she pulled out her phone. Her fingers hovered over the screen for a moment before she began to type. No long explanation, no paragraphs of emotion, just a single line. "Tomorrow you'll understand." She hit send, slipping the phone back into her bag without waiting for a reply. The ride home was slow, the city lights blurring past her. She looked out at the familiar streets, the market stalls closing for the night, the smell of roasted corn still drifting in the air. She thought about what tomorrow would bring, not with fear but with quiet excitement. By the time she reached her doorstep, she felt lighter. She unlocked her door, stepped inside, and let the silence of her home wrap around her. There would be no arguments tonight, no shouting, no tears. Just peace. She had left that table without a scene, but the real scene, the one they would all remember, was yet to come. And when it did, it would speak louder than anything she could have said that night. The next morning, the sun was bright over Luwina, and the streets were already alive with chatter, motorbikes, and the smell of fresh bread. At his favorite cafe, Kelechi sat with the same group of friends from the night before. They were laughing over coffee, the memory of his jokes, still hanging in the air like a private joke they thought no one else understood. The bell over the cafe door jingled, and in walked Amina. She wasn't rushed, she wasn't timid. She moved with the kind of calm that made people stop and notice. Her golden Ankara dress caught the light streaming in from the window, and her head was held high. She scanned the room briefly, her eyes passing over Kelechi and his friends without a flicker of hesitation, before settling on the counter where the cafe owner stood. "I'd like to speak to you for a moment," she said warmly to him. The owner smiled, nodding for her to come closer. The cafe grew quieter, curiosity filling the air. Even Kelechi stopped mid-laugh, his eyes narrowing slightly as he watched her. Amina didn't look at him. She reached into her bag and pulled out a neat envelope. "Everything we discussed is ready," she told the owner, sliding it across the counter. He opened it, glanced inside, and then looked up at her with a broad smile. "Congratulations," he said. "It's official. You're now one of the major investors in this cafe." For a split second the room seemed to freeze. The clink of cups stopped, the hum of conversation faded, and all eyes turned to her. Amina simply smiled, thanked the owner and shook his hand. At their table Kelechi's friends stared, some wide-eyed, others hiding smirks. Kelechi himself leaned back slowly, confusion flickering across his face. This was not the woman from last night. This was someone entirely different, someone he could no longer make small. Without glancing his way, Amina turned and began walking toward the door, the morning sunlight spilling in ahead of her. She had said nothing to him. All eyes in the cafe were on her as the owner brought out a slim folder from behind the counter. He opened it on the polished wooden surface, sliding a pen toward her. Amina's movements were slow, deliberate, graceful, like a woman who knew exactly what she was doing. She took the pen in her hand, signed her name in neat, confident strokes, and then placed it back down with a soft click. "There," the owner said with a smile that reached his eyes. "It's official. Welcome to the team, Amina. You are now one of the major investors in this cafe." The words seemed to echo in the air. Kelechi's friends exchanged startled glances, some leaning slightly forward as if to be sure they had heard correctly. Just the night before, they had been laughing at her. dismissing her as the quiet village girl. Now she was standing in front of them, making moves that none of them had seen coming. What they didn't know, and what made this moment even sweeter, was that Amina had been working toward this for months. Every spare coin from her tailoring business, every extra order she took on, every late night she spent stitching under the dim light of her small shop had been part of this plan. She had met with the cafe owner in secret, negotiated her stake, and prepared all the documents quietly, without a single word to Kelechi. Kelechi himself sat frozen in his chair, his hand resting on his coffee cup, but not lifting it. The smirk he had worn so easily the night before was gone, replaced by something tighter, confusion mixed with discomfort. He looked at her as if he was seeing her for the first time. Amina didn't give him the satisfaction of meeting his gaze. She thanked the owner warmly, picked up her bag and turned toward the door. Every step she took was measured, steady and unhurried, like a woman who had just reclaimed far more than her dignity. And though she left the cafe without a single word to him, her silence spoke louder than anything she could have said. For a moment the cafe felt like it had stopped breathing. The clinking of cups, the shuffle of chairs, even the low hum of conversation, all of it faded into stillness. The same friends who had laughed the loudest at her expense the night before now sat frozen, eyes fixed on Amina as if they weren't quite sure how to process what they had just seen. It wasn't just surprise. It was the uncomfortable kind of silence that comes when a joke has backfired in the worst possible way. Their faces told the story. The man who had slapped the table in laughter last night now stared at the floor. The woman who had covered her mouth to hide her giggles was now chewing her lip, her coffee untouched. The amusement they had shared was gone, replaced by something heavier, guilt, maybe even respect. And then there was Kelechi. The confident smirk he had worn so easily last night had slipped away, leaving only confusion in its place. He leaned back in his chair, eyes following Amina as if searching for some sign that this was a game, some chance to laugh it off. But she didn't look at him. Not once. That, more than anything, seemed to unsettle him. Inside, Amina felt calm. Not triumphant in a loud way but steady, like someone who knew she had shifted the balance without raising her voice. She didn't need them to clap for her or to apologize. The silence in the room was enough. It was the kind of silence that carried weight, the kind that would linger in their minds long after she walked out the door. She reached for the handle, the warm sunlight spilling in from outside. Behind her, the room remained hushed. No one dared to break it, not even Kelechi. And as she stepped into the street, leaving the cafe behind, she knew they would never look at her the same way again. Kelechi finally stood from his chair, his movements stiff, as if his body didn't quite know whether to follow her or stay put. He caught up to her just as she reached the cafe door, his voice lower than usual, stripped of the easy confidence he carried the night before. "Amina, I didn't mean," he began, his words stumbling over themselves like they were rushing to catch up with the moment. She paused, just enough to let the weight of silence hang between them, but she didn't turn fully toward him. Her voice was calm, almost soft, but every syllable was deliberate. "You meant it," she said, her eyes steady on the sunlight pouring through the glass door. "And now I mean this." There was no anger in her tone, no raised voice, no sharp edge. But somehow those few words carried more finality than shouting ever could. Without waiting for his reply, she pushed the door open and stepped outside. The sound of it closing behind her felt like a line being drawn, a line he couldn't cross. Kelechi stood there for a moment, his hand still half raised as if he might call her back. But the words wouldn't come. Maybe because deep down he knew she was right. He had meant it the night before. The jokes, the little digs, the way he used her as entertainment, it had all been intentional, even if he wanted to pretend otherwise now. Outside, Amina walked down the street with the same calm grace she had carried into the cafe. She didn't need to see his face to know he was watching her go. She didn't need his regret to validate her worth. She had already taken back the part of herself he had tried to shrink. Her steps didn't falter. Her gaze didn't drop. She simply kept walking, leaving him in the doorway with nothing but the echo of her words, and the quiet realization that she wasn't coming back. The moment Amina stepped outside, the warmth of the sun wrapped around her like a blessing. The golden Ankara dress she had chosen so carefully the night before now shimmered under the daylight, catching every glint of light as she moved. Yesterday, she had worn it hoping to make Kelechi proud, Today it was no longer about him, it was about her. Her heels clicked lightly against the pavement as she walked. Not hurried, not hesitant, just steady and sure. The air felt different out here, cleaner, as if the world itself had shifted to make space for the woman she had become overnight. She could still feel the weight of the eyes from inside the cafe, but instead of shrinking under it, she let it roll off her like water. Those stares no longer held power over her. They were simply witnesses to her freedom. She thought about the girl she had been last night, the one who sat quietly at that table, swallowing the sting of his words, trying to keep her dignity intact while the room laughed around her. That girl had left the cafe with her, but she had also transformed along the way. This version of herself didn't need to be invited into anyone's world. She could build her own. A soft breeze lifted the edge of her dress as she passed shop windows, and in one reflection, she caught sight of her own smile. It wasn't wide or boastful. It was small, calm, and entirely real. She didn't need applause, and she didn't need an apology. She had something far better: peace. As she turned down the street toward her tailoring shop, she felt a quiet certainty settle in her chest. She was walking into a future that belonged only to her. And for the first time, every step she took felt like a step toward the life she deserved. Her head stayed high, her heart stayed light, and her spirit, finally, felt completely unshackled. In the weeks that followed, Amina poured all her focus into her tailoring business. What had once been a small shop with just her behind the sewing machine began to grow, slowly but surely. She took the money she had saved, along with the profits from her cafe investment, and bought 2 more machines. Then she went back to the same villages she used to call home, places where young women dreamed but had few chances, and invited them to join her. At first, they came shy and uncertain, their hands clumsy with the fabric, their eyes avoiding hers. But Amina remembered being like that 2 years ago. She was patient, teaching them how to cut patterns, how to stitch clean seams, how to add details that made a dress special. She didn't just show them how to sew. She showed them how to price their work, talk to customers, and believe in the value of their skills. Soon the shop was filled with life. The hum of machines, bursts of laughter, the rustle of fabric being spread across tables. The women began to stand taller, to greet customers with confidence, to take pride in the money they earned for themselves. For Amina, this wasn't just about business. It was about giving these women the kind of freedom she had fought for herself. She wanted them to know that they didn't have to stay in places, or with people, who made them feel small. One evening, as she locked up the shop, she looked inside at the women still laughing and working late, and a warmth spread through her chest. This was her real victory, not proving Kelechi wrong, not silencing the laughter from that night, but building something that would outlast the memory of it. She wasn't just making clothes anymore. She was making futures. It started small. A neighbor telling a shopkeeper, a cafe worker whispering to a friend. Soon, the story of Amina's quiet strength began to travel through the streets of Lewina like a warm wind. But it wasn't told in the sharp, gossipy way stories usually spread in small towns. This one carried a different tone. People didn't talk about the night Kelechi mocked her to humiliate her. They talked about how she walked away without raising her voice, how she came back the next day and stood taller than anyone expected. Don't mistake her silence for weakness, some would say, shaking their heads with a smile. She speaks with actions. And in a place where women were often told to endure, to stay quiet for the sake of peace, Amina's story felt like a spark in the dark. Even the people who had been in the cafe that morning began to retell it differently. They didn't focus on Kelechi's embarrassment. They focused on the way she signed those papers, calm and steady, as if she had been planning her moment for years. They spoke about how her business had grown, how she was hiring women from villages who now stood proud and independent. Young girls began to pass her shop on their way to school, stealing glances inside, whispering to each other, "That's her. That's the one." Mothers began bringing their daughters to meet her, hoping some of that quiet courage might rub off. One afternoon, an elderly woman stopped her in the market. "Child," she said, gripping Amina's hand, "you've shown us all something important. Respect isn't asked for. It's earned and it's kept." Amina walked away from that moment smiling. Her story was no longer just her own. It belonged to every woman in Lewina who had ever been underestimated. And that, she thought, was the kind of legacy worth leaving. In the end, that night was never remembered for his cruel jokes or the laughter that tried to shrink her. It was remembered for what came after, for the way Amina carried herself with calm dignity, for the way she turned humiliation into power. The moment he tried to make her small became the moment she showed just how big her spirit truly was. People in Luina still talk about it, not with pity but with admiration. They say she didn't just walk away from disrespect, she walked toward something better. She didn't waste her energy shouting or trying to change him. She invested it into building her own life, one that didn't depend on his approval. The women she trained, the young girls who looked up to her, the quiet respect she earned, all of it grew from that single decision to choose dignity over drama. And perhaps that was the real lesson. Strength isn't always loud and victory doesn't always look like a fight. Years later, when people tell her story, they don't even mention his name. They just say, there was a woman who knew her worth, and she made sure the world knew it too. And Amina, wherever she is, smiles, because that's exactly how she wanted to be remembered.